Great. Well, I think we should make a start. It's a couple of minutes past 2 o'clock our time. Before we start on an introduction, just one quick note, which is that we are recording this session. So if you don't give consent to be recorded, then please do turn off your camera. So to kick us off, thank you for joining us. It's fantastic to see people attending. My name is Gordon Hector. Together with my colleague Kate Palmer, we are the team at Urban Foresight. We are an innovation company based in the UK. We work in a range of projects around the world, ranging from the future mobility, electrification, smart cities, and future economies. And we're really delighted to welcome you to the launch of the 2021 EV City Casebook. This program is about inspiration, about learning from the most interesting ideas and places. And today's session is about introducing the casebook. It will pick out some of the most important conclusions from the research. We hope it will help others understand the exciting approaches that we've had the pleasure of getting to know in this project. This is the third EV City Casebook, and since the last one in 2014, electrification is at a completely different level of awareness and understanding and implementation. Countless cities across the world have some kind of EV in their streets. We've had several years of trials and pilots. There are now vibrant markets in vehicles, in infrastructure, in technology. For that reason, the focus of this year's casebook and the policy guide, and the bulk of the content we will talk about, is about scaling up, getting beyond those early initiatives, rapidly accelerating adoption, and ultimately moving towards a zero emissions future. So we hope that today's session is about sharing some of that inspiration and helping more places understand how to go on that progression. So our agenda for today, in the next 45 minutes or so, we will cover, first of all, some introductory remarks from the project partners. Second, an overview of the casebook itself, giving a description of how it was compiled, the cities it covers. Third, we'll talk about some of the policy recommendations report. We won't talk about all of them, but we'll give you a sense of the main headline conclusions. That will then lead into a discussion of a maturity model, which is a tool that we have developed for this program. And then finally, we'll take questions. The way that we'll structure questions is through the chat function. So if at any point you have a question, feel free to write it down there. And then at the end of our presentation, if we haven't already addressed your question, then we'll pick it up and we'll come to it at the end. So any questions in the chat function, and please do feel free to fire stuff in there. So let's start with an introduction from the project partners. Like I say, Kate and I are from Urban Foresight. This report is a collaboration between the Electric Vehicles Initiative and the Hybrid Electric Vehicle Technology Collaboration Programme. Both organisations have supported the project, which we at Urban Foresight, together with the International Agency, have carried out. So to give a perspective from the EVI, I'd like to first of all hand over to Thierry on behalf of the EVI to give some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Gordon and Kate. Just a quick mic check. Can you guys hear me okay? Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gordon and Kate, and good morning or afternoon, everyone. I very much appreciate the opportunity to provide a few remarks today on behalf of Canada, co-chairs together with China of EVI, as we launch the third EV City Casebook and Policy Guide. Let me start by saying that I hope you and your families are doing well. For some of us, certainly for us here in Canada, we are actually coming up on our 1-year anniversary of working from home. Despite the losses that mark this milestone, it is also a time to take stock of the more positive developments. The global pandemic illustrated the importance of public transportation and the efficient movement of people and goods. The year saw historic investments around the idea of building back better and long-lasting commitments to build a stronger, cleaner, and more affordable transportation system. Crucially, the last year also brought into sharp relief the importance of cities in transitioning to a safe, equitable, clean transportation system, be it buses, taxis, private or shared mobility, and of course the resilience of urban areas on every continent throughout this trying time. This is the third City Casebook and Policy Guide, and I believe never has there been a more urgent need for cities to come together to learn from each other's experiences, showcase their leadership, and develop blueprints for others to follow. The policy maturity model allows cities to navigate their scaling up efforts while recognizing that cities are not a homogeneous group, but one with different political, financial, social, and policy contexts, as you guys mentioned in your report. Yet their ability to make a difference and to get to work on some of the many challenges facing us unite them, and striving to lead by example, establish social equity outcomes, and build resilience in infrastructure and energy systems, to name just a few of the lessons learned identified in the casebook. Above all, this work is a call to action, the very essence of EVI. I'd like to thank Urban Foresight for their excellent work, and I'm very much looking forward to the webinar and the conversation. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Terry. And Carol, over to you. Sounds like a couple of technical issues with Carol. Any joy, Carol? You should be able to unmute it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay, very good. Thank you. I guess I had been unmuted automatically. Apologies for that. Thank you again to Kate and Gordon for the opportunity to say a few words today. Good morning also, afternoon or evening to all of you who've taken the time out of your busy day to attend this webinar. I hope you're doing well. Like Thierry, I'm speaking to you from my home in Canada today. It's a great pleasure to be participating in today's event, highlighting the global progress in the area of electric mobility since the launch of the first EV City Casebook in 2012. The International Energy Agency Hybrid and Electric Vehicle Technology Collaboration Program, also known as the HEV TCP for short, is happy to have contributed to the development of this EV City Casebook and Policy Guide, as well as to the 2012 and 2014 editions. For more than 25 years, the HEV TCP, which today represents a total of 19 member countries, has been collaborating on projects such as this one to advance our understanding and address the barriers to the mass adoption of electric vehicles. The TCP's mission focuses on fostering the international exchange of information and experiences, and the EV City Casebook and Policy Guide is a key example of how this is being accomplished. I strongly believe that the compilation of city-level activities and policies presented in the report being launched today will be a source of motivation and inspiration for others in their efforts to advance the uptake of electric vehicles. I'd like to thank Urban Foresight for their excellent work in identifying a range of case studies from around the globe and for synthesizing their research into policy guidance that will inform cities and other interested parties. It's exciting to be part of this joint initiative with the EVI, and I look forward to the rest of today's event. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Well, without further ado, let's jump into the content of the report. So at this point, I'll hand over to my colleague, Kate, who's going to give us a reminder of how the EV City Casebook was put together and a sense of the case studies that we cover in the report. So Kate, over to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Gordon. Can you hear me okay? Perfect, brilliant. So the EV City Casebook is a showcase of cities building better, cleaner mobility through EVs, designed to inspire others to move towards mass electric mobility. Since the first EV City Casebook in 2012, cities across the world have overseen huge changes in mobility. The Casebook showcases 50 cities across 20 countries and 5 continents with 10 policy recommendations on how to scale up EVs globally. So the remit of the Casebook was to produce a guide for cities aiming to benchmark their progress to date and seeking policy guidance to advance electrification. With the Casebook, both studies showcasing city-level scale adoption of EVs, and policy guidance quantifying strategies and learning from best practice. The casebook is designed for a wide audience, for city managers, city political leaders, national policy officials, managers of procurement, transport and economic development, the EV and transport industry, media and research. The policy guide answers pertinent questions for these stakeholders, such as what kind of policy, financial and legal tools can they use to speed up adoption? How do cities need to work with vehicle manufacturers, energy providers and their citizens to create support for faster change? And how can cities learn from their counterparts around the world to move to mass EV adoption? Collation of the evidence base for the EV City Casebook was multifaceted. This casebook was informed by 50 interviews with city managers and experts, covering cities in 20 countries across the world. These interviews built upon desk research to generate deeper research and understanding. The survey ran from May to September 2020, supporting engagement and enabling a full global scan of relevant case studies. There were also questions pertaining to the current pandemic and the impact on transport planning, budgets and targets, adding an additional layer of insight. The workshops took place in October and validated our findings. With nearly 50 attendees across the 2 sessions, we discussed city-level challenges to electrification and geographical differences in implementing policy to support EV and infrastructure deployment. The casebook is a global analysis of inspiring ideas, policy pioneers, and city-led innovation in electric vehicles. The first 5 chapters profile different vehicle modes encompassing all city-level road transport. Each chapter presents case study cities with a brief description of their approach and key insights from their journey towards mass EV use. The casebook was structured in this way so that stakeholders could read a particular chapter and understand best practices from a diverse range of countries. The EV City Casebook pulls out interesting aspects of vehicle electrification from cities across the world. The case studies were not chosen as a ranking, but to highlight best practice on how different city authorities across all the continents have supported and enabled electrification of various types of transport. This resulted in a much more diverse policy guidance with insights that are pertinent to cities across the globe. In total, the 50 cities included in the casebook have populations of over 160 million people. For each of the 5 transport types, there is a longer case study which has a deep dive into all aspects of the transport electrification journey of the city, with many other case studies focusing on a particularly interesting aspect of a city's achievement. For buses, Shenzhen has been chosen as the deep dive case study. Shenzhen was the first city in the world to fully electrify its bus fleet in 2017. Fiscal incentives, charging infrastructure, optimizing bus schedules, and industry partnerships were all contributing factors to this success. Dundee is the deep dive case study for taxi and ride-hailing services. Dundee has worked closely with the taxi industry to deliver a range of policy changes, incentives, and infrastructure to support and encourage the trade to make the switch to electric vehicles. For city fleets, we've examined all aspects of electrification of Stockholm's city authority fleets. Stockholm has supported EV adoption in its municipal fleet by delivering a leading procurement strategy that considers EVs first for any vehicle replacement and transport service. Madrid was chosen for shared mobility. Multiple car share schemes are operating in Madrid in a dynamic, competitive market. Finally, there is a deep dive into electrification of San Francisco's private vehicles. Long-term support for organic market growth, regulation to increase EV use, and streamlining charging infrastructure processes have all been key to EV deployment in the city. In addition to these 5 interesting case studies, there are 45 more in the EV City Casebook examining different aspects of transport electrification in cities across the world. Over to you, Gordon.
On mute, there's always one. For the next 15-20 minutes or so, we'll cover the policy recommendations that came out of the project. So the purpose of this section is to take the combined experience of all those cities that Kate has talked about and the different modes that we looked at, and identify themes that are held in common so that more cities can learn from them. And the place to start assessing these policy options is to understand the patterns and challenges facing cities. And as a reminder, these are challenges that we think are particularly important for getting beyond early stage EV programs and looking to mass adoption. By far the most common challenge was incentives for EVs and making them sustainable for the long term. It's not that it's necessarily easy to design incentives for the first EV programs, but because numbers are low at first, places often don't have to worry too much about cost or about how different incentives last for different lengths of time, or how they interact with existing transport systems. So it's not that straightforward to start, but those considerations are less important. As EV numbers increase and as city policy starts to look at mass adoption, that starts to change. So for example, many cities offer discounted licensing for EV taxis. They offer discounted charging for private cars, or they top up national subsidy schemes for buying vehicles. Now that is affordable and sustainable at first, but it becomes much more difficult financially for cities as EV numbers increase. Other sorts of incentive can become impractical. So for example, in early stage programs, many cities give particular benefits to EVs, allowing them to access bus lanes, for example, or giving them special access rights in terms of road space. And again, that's okay when 5% of your vehicles are EVs. When it's 10 or 20 or 50, that becomes impractical. So the first big challenge that many cities are facing is incentives beyond those early stage incentives across financial, road space, and other tools. The second challenge is in the vehicles themselves. For cars and for smaller vehicles, manufacturers, you'll know this, they compete on range, price, and reliability. There is a thriving, healthy market, and we should see price parity in many countries, and depending on the vehicle, either this year or soon. But many cities face emissions challenges from larger vehicles, buses, lorries, heavy goods vehicles, and similar. When larger vehicles like those often have demanding standards in terms of reliability, safety, and power, and they often serve a particular policy or social function, bus services or gritters in those of us in a colder climate. Many cities identify the relatively immature technology of those vehicles as a challenge to mass adoption. So the first step in private vehicles was perhaps easier. Now there's a challenge in other types of vehicle. Thirdly, the perception that EVs in private and business vehicles, that the perception that they're only for rich people is starting to change. The running costs are increasingly recognized as lower. The upfront cost of batteries is reducing, but that perception still exists. And again, that's manageable if a small proportion of vehicles are EVs. But if you want mass adoption, then you need to look at much wider take-up and to address those concerns. So many cities are considering demarketing petrol and diesel cars. They're considering or have already stopped them accessing key locations in a city. Some countries are looking at bans on petrol and diesel in the decades ahead. So the concern is raised, not so much that EVs would affect low-income people, but that there is a perception that that is the case, and that perception, as much as the reality, was the concern. Fourth point, policy levers sit at different levels of government. Increasing EV uptake is connected with a wide range of policy, regulatory, and funding tools with incentives and with targets. Not all cities control those levers. Most countries run subsidy schemes at a national level, and the capacity of cities in financial and fiscal powers varies very significantly. It's also quite common for certain aspects of transport regulation, such as bus fleets or taxis, to be done at a state, regional, or federal level. So identifying how to blend the combinations of local, regional, and national, and in some cases international approaches was raised as a challenge. And then the final challenge, initial EV pilots require new infrastructure. And again, it's not that is necessarily easy. We shouldn't underestimate the challenges of starting EV infrastructure. but it can be implemented as a rule without significant impacts on wider power networks and suppliers. And that is not the case for mass EV use. It's a fundamentally different sort of challenge if you have the majority or the vast majority of your vehicles electrified. That requires a much more fundamental rethink of power networks and how transport systems interact with organizations like grid suppliers and electricity networks. So those 5 challenges were the most common themes that the cities conveyed to us. That's then informed our recommendations on what cities should do. We have 10, and there's some detail in the report. I'll probably just pick out what I think are the most important things and perhaps just touch on others. Oh, sorry, clicked ahead there. Sorry, just lost my screen there. There we are. So number 1, targets. By this we mean targets for total EV numbers, a proportion of vehicles being EVs, a target for infrastructure rollout, or perhaps the complete electrification of a particular vehicle type or fleet, or an overall emissions reduction target. The view of cities was that in an early stage EV program, you need to be quite careful over setting a target that can look unrealistic. It can look too unconnected from reality, too much of an aspiration to change things. But once a city has a basic level of charging infrastructure, once it is moving towards strategic planning on a range of EV issues, then setting a city-wide target can be effective. It can bring different partners together. It can give confidence to the market that there is policy intention and long-term intention. And if, and it's a big if it's backed up by a clear action plan showing who's going to do what to achieve that plan and is therefore credible, then it can drive change. So targets play a different role in earlier or more mature systems. The second point follows on from that about governance. EV uptake is a complex policy problem. It requires the input of multiple different organizations and affects multiple different aspects of a city's operation. Early EV programs can often be managed effectively without dedicated staff. We often find that a city would have one person who was particularly passionate about EVs, but it wasn't their responsibility or their job. They can start by identifying informal resource or by ad hoc initiatives and communications that are targeted at different organizations on a fairly informal basis. Cities which showed sustained progress to scaling up set a vision and engaged a wide range of private, public and civic organizations in translating that vision into reality. And they created governance structures to formalize those relationships and create a place in which discussions and decisions and accountability could be focused. So one example, San Francisco's EV working group is sometimes seen as the gold standard of policy co-creation with public leadership, a range of interested parties. And it's credited, I think, with identifying a practical role for each organization. It's also where that balance of local, regional and national can be addressed because you can have national representatives. So to get to mass adoption, governance needs more formal structures and focus and leadership. The third point about showing EV benefits. This is partly driven by the social equity concerns just mentioned, but also the importance of looking at vehicles beyond private cars. Now there's a clear opportunity here. Factoring in reduced maintenance fees and lower running costs, many EV fleets represent good value over their entire lifetime. For some cities, electrification is part of a wider growth and reputation strategy to try and build a name for quality of life and livability, being clean and green. And in the long term, EVs could even reduce some spending pressures elsewhere in city budgets, for example, healthcare costs driven by urban air pollution. But cities have quite different financial arrangements for different fleets. Financial planning can be as short as 1 to 2 years, and quite often transport budgets sit separately to wider social expenditure. So the full benefits of EVs are only visible if a city has a budgeting process which can capture those long-term costs and savings and can demonstrate long-term benefits across a range of public policy priorities. So one way of expressing this for a city is, does your public health clean air team play a role in your EV program? If not, that's a missed opportunity. And the best cities we spoke to had absorbed that kind of thinking. On incentives, I mean, there's a huge amount in the report, so perhaps I'll just touch on a couple of things, and folks can go and read the report for further detail. By far the most important thing, avoiding sudden changes to financial incentives. Incentives have to be clear, predictable, and long-term. So even if a city ultimately wants to reduce subsidies as the EV market matures and as the need for public subsidy reduces, sudden reductions done too soon can deflate markets and they can stunt uptake. So whatever the long-term plan is, consistency and avoiding sudden changes is important. It's a similar point about places increasingly considering EV discounts rather than EV free services. So in general, it is easier to increase an existing charge than it is to introduce a new one, for the simple reason that user consent is more likely if the principle of paying is already established. So therefore, one option is design a system with some level of cost, for example, a license cost, a charging rate, parking charges, congestion charges, some kind of cost established in principle, even if the rates are low or heavily discounted. Now that makes it easier for a city to avoid revenue dependency on high pollution vehicles, and it means that future sources of revenue and making EVs financially sustainable has been built in from an earlier point. And one final kind of point about incentives before we move on. Sharing capital costs. In most cities, early stage EV investments are often small scale. They are often capable of being funded by fleet owners, cities and investors in their own right, or national subsidies have reduced costs and risk. Scaling up, particularly in infrastructure, can require much more significant investment. But systems running at scale also create an opportunity to create new business models to share value, particularly in bringing in private investors where a clear opportunity can be defined. So one example we discuss in the casebook is Santiago de Chile, where the electrification of buses were funded by utility companies buying buses, taking the risk and investing capital and leasing them to operators who could then expand their EV fleets without additional pressure on their balance sheets. So like I said, there's a couple of ideas in there that could have fallen under incentives, but the key principle is you can design incentives for the long term. The fifth point is a simple one. Many cities directly control or own their fleets, so they can lead by example and start from those. If you want mass adoption across the city, then starting with your own fleet seems a logical place to begin. The sixth one, direct relationships with manufacturers and technology providers. Because there are concerns over the larger vehicles or the more specialist vehicles, the cities which have seen the fastest transitions have engaged directly with manufacturers to develop and deploy new technology. And we saw this particularly in China, where there's a particular context, obviously, but it's a principle that we think holds for cities across the world. It works for manufacturers because they can benefit from faster iteration and feedback on technology that they're developing for their clients. And for cities, they can shape vehicles and infrastructure and design vehicles which suit their history and geography. I think one of the things we've learned in electric vehicles over the past couple of years is that some city needs for public transport for certain types of vehicle are very specific. So direct relationships with manufacturers, we think, is a good approach for cities to get something that works for them. Seventh point about moving to responsive systems. One clear conclusion from the research is that infrastructure remains a precondition of EV uptake. Places that are more mature realize that part of that is a clear, predictable process to respond to demand. So while early EV projects are likely to be led by cities themselves or enthusiastic partners, mass EV adoption will take place in a context of much higher awareness from consumers and from businesses. And one risk in that situation is that potential demand emerges before infrastructure is ready. So unexpected demand from a particular sector, an area, or type of vehicle. So cities on the path to scaling up will have developed processes by which potential EV users can request new infrastructure, and decisions on funding, installation, costs, maintenance are made quickly and fairly and consistently. Now that's a complement to other approaches in infrastructure, such as mass rollout based on central planning, or looking at data or energy use or population growth. But the difference between an early and mature stage is often that mindset of being able to respond to demand and building a responsive system. The eighth point is about is a reflection of the particular challenges in energy management, comparing an early versus a mature system. Maintenance represents a really significant pressure and cost base in a large-scale system. And in the report, we go into make a series of recommendations. So, for example, contracts can be designed to reflect a city's future needs with minimum warranty periods that are longer than perhaps equivalent technology, requiring providers to have local staff to prevent any shortfall in assistance, building in specific maximum downtimes or failure rates or response times, and working alongside grid and utilities companies to ensure governance between EV energy systems and wider generation and distribution is clear. And the final 2 points, kind of quite simple ones. Future-proofing for digital innovation. Mobility as a service is a topic on many people's minds. It's this buzzword that cities across the world are exploring. That's probably an entire casebook and webinar in its own right. The relevance for electrification is that common standards of data and back office sharing of information can be built into certain aspects of electrification, and that can future-proof for future mass systems which are emerging around the world. Not least as the cities, particularly in Europe, have seen smaller electric vehicles, e-scooters and so on, rapidly expanding over the past couple of years. And then the final one, establishing social equity outcomes. That's both designing policy. So there are some places, for example, who increase the subsidy for a vehicle for lower income groups, so they target certain groups more, but also about communication. So demonstrating that reducing emissions and cleaner air can be a matter of social justice. So in brief, those are the 5 challenges that cities, that we identified working with cities, and those are the 10 core policy recommendations to help cities on the journey from early stage to mature EV systems. So that's the policy recommendation section, and now I'll hand back to Kate to give an introduction to the maturity model. Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Gordon. So what is a maturity model and why is it included in the project? Our purpose is to show what lessons can be learned and taken from one city to another. This is a challenge in general and more specifically for this project. The question is, how do you draw out policy lessons from across the world? As you know, cities sit in very different political and social systems. They have different histories and geographies, and the level of autonomy, particularly fiscal autonomy, but also regulatory power and direct influence over vehicles and fleets in a city, varies hugely. With this diversity, the question is, how do we make meaningful conclusions across cities? So to answer this, we've developed a tool called the maturity model. Now, it's a concept that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. The maturity model is an analytical tool to help an organisation understand how advanced its plans are in any given area and what it can do next. They've been used in a wide range of fields to help organisations benchmark progress, challenge themselves on the status of their operations, and understand how to move to the next step. We thought it was particularly appropriate for this project, where we're trying to help navigate the path to scaling up, and where we're trying to map across the experiences of different cities onto other contexts. Gordon will now go a bit more information about the maturity model we've developed.
Yeah, so that's what a maturity model is, and this diagram is a visual representation of that model. These categories we refer to as the domains of the maturity model, and they represent the broad categories of work which underpin EV success. So some of it is self-explanatory, but perhaps just a few things to note. Strategy and management, that is about an overall plan, but also the operational grip that underpins that plan. So a plan that also considers accountability and resources and how different organizations need to work there. Investment and incentives, that's straightforward, as is infrastructure provision. Fleets, that's not just about private vehicles. So it's a really important point that mature EV cities recognize that different sorts of fleet in a city have different factors and stakeholders who can shape the use of other types of vehicle. So for example, logistic companies, private fleets, the city's own vehicles. So tailoring policies and considering them as slightly distinct is essential. Infrastructure operations, I mean, that's distinct from creating infrastructure because there are specific considerations such as maintenance, the relationship with energy generation networks, utilities, and the potential for integration with renewables and digital coordination providers, that it felt that was an important enough aspect to bring out in its own right. Then finally, communications and engagement, that runs through everything, but again, there are specific audiences and approaches that cities can take to make sure their objectives are clear, that plans and timelines help people prepare for a shift to EV and build political and public support for the transition. Now, these challenges naturally overlap and they are complementary. Some cities will also have further considerations reflecting their own political or financial context, but the conclusion from the cities in this project is that these categories represent the main areas of focus in which it makes most sense for cities to advance plans. In other words, a city looking to scale up should be thinking across all of these elements. But of course, this isn't just about understanding in which areas a city should work. It's also about understanding at what level of sophistication a city is working and trying to help any city benchmark where they are in terms of progress and give them a sense of how they can progress further. So the top right hand quadrant there is adding another element to the model, which is different maturity levels. So these 5 categories are designed to capture the broad range of EV approaches from initial and ad hoc projects through a tactical, strategic and integrated approach through to a fully optimized and continuously improving system. So these are phrases which capture the rough levels of maturity. So in summary, what the model is trying to do to help cities accelerate the progress is give the range of areas in which they need to work and a sense of the levels of progression they can achieve within those areas. We probably won't cover every aspect of the maturity model. Within each of those domains, there's a further 3 categories or so. So 5 levels of maturity with 18 themes. That would make for quite a long webinar. What we thought we'd do is give you a sense of how it can be used with a couple of particularly interesting or important themes within those domains, and then encourage you to go and have a look yourselves. So the next couple of slides represent a simplified version of what we have in the full report. So the first one, governance. At a basic level, what you would expect to see is pretty ad hoc, no formal governance, most likely an individual or some passionate organizations, but no formal structures. As you move through successive levels of sophistication, and as a city builds its maturity in these, we would expect to move through defined evaluation, so monitoring, and some kind of forum for tracking progress, into some form of dedicated group or steering group or forum or collaboration to oversee approaches, and ultimately up to a collaborative system of governance that includes input from users. And that last point is quite an important theme in the model, that what we define as optimized in many of these domains quite often involves a feedback system with users. So it's not just doing things to people, but we're creating a dynamic system that can unlock systemic changes. Second example, residential charging. We picked this one out because it's a good example of a core question facing many cities, distinct from public and workplace charging. And at a basic level, it's all but random. Individual homeowners doing their own thing, some city projects, but again, fundamentally ad hoc. Tactical is where there's slightly more coordination. And as you progress through levels of sophistication, that capacity to respond to demand increases, and uptake increases, through to integrating charging into other aspects of city policy in what we call the integrated category. So, for example, rules on new developments. And again, that's a theme across the model, that in the integrated level of maturity, that's when EV policy starts to be seen in its wider context of other city policy areas. And that's the level at which we think mass change can really be unlocked. And then for residential charging, an optimized system is one where every possible home has access, but again, it's responsive and it's two-way. And in this case, linking to grid demands and thinking about the potential of electric vehicles in balancing the grid and as a form of storage and as a two-way system. That's what the optimized level could look like. And a final example, just to again give you a sense of the flavor of the maturity model, municipal fleets. It feels at the moment like many cities are somewhere between tactical and strategic. Many places have got beyond early kind of pilots and trials with EVs. That's probably what we saw in many cities 3 to 5 years ago. Now there are formal business cases. There is a political goodwill towards EVs. We're starting to see large numbers of EVs across different service areas beyond those relatively straightforward smaller vehicles, vans, cars, and so on, into slightly harder fleets, importantly with a renewal strategy. And as you work through the levels of maturity, again, that kind of builds into wider integration with the city's priorities and ultimately towards the ultimate phasing out of fossil fuel vehicles and a wider sense of how electric vehicles meet the city's goals. So that in 40 minutes or so is a summary of how the EV City Casebook and Policy Guide was commissioned, how we approach the challenge and the interesting different ways that cities around the world have approached electrification, and pull that out into a set of policy challenges, recommendations, and a maturity model to help cities benchmark and further their progress. So we now have some time for questions. We said at the start if people wanted to post them in the chat function. Fab. So the first question is, do we think that any city in the casebook has got to optimized in many of the maturity models domains? And the short answer, Kate, disagree if you want to. The short answer is no. That we see optimize as this it's kind of utopia of EV policy. And I think what's important in our minds is that will shift. A maturity model written in 5 or 10 years' time might have refined its sense of what is normal and what progress counts as, but also what technologies might have evolved that will further unlock benefits from EVs. The reason that optimized quite often includes responsive systems and self-improving systems is that if you're at the most mature level, that's what you should be capable of doing, of having a system that is constantly generating feedback from users and is allowing you to improve and gets you into a virtuous cycle of improvement. So the short answer is no, but perhaps if we repeat the exercise in 5 years, we might have seen someone hit the heights. A question from Thierry. Yeah, I mean, yes. I think we find that cities' capacities vary significantly by vehicle type, and it's part of the reason the document is structured in the way it is, looking at a vehicle type. So sorry, the question is, have you seen cities progress from early stages of basic zero emission, EV awareness to more advanced stages? So not just aware, but actually educated. Part of the reason the document is structured around vehicle modes is that many places are more advanced at particular vehicle types, and that's a combination of their political and policy systems, also just the history by which they have looked at electrification. And what that tends to mean is that genuine education about a particular sort of vehicle can be much more advanced than it might be in other forms of vehicle, and that's often influenced by the market. So the market in private cars, particularly in Europe, is fiercely competitive, well advanced, and that means that for many places they understand how electric vehicles work in that particular context. It's much more challenging in other vehicle types. So yes, we have, but I think it varies quite considerably by vehicle type. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Kate. Or...
Yes, actually, I was going to say that when we were putting together the cities for this casebook, we were trying kind of not to just have an update on the previous casebook, because a lot of the cities that originally featured in 2012 kind of were ahead of the curve then, and are still ahead of the curve now, and are still like doing very well. So we had to do a lot of research to ensure we had that kind of global coverage, and went and searched further afield.
Grand. Well, if anyone else wants to kind of come in with the question, we've got one from Hector. If anyone else would like to come in, then we can handle it, and otherwise wrap up. But Hector's question from our work: what do we feel is the growing role of cities in fostering greater EV adoption in conjunction with subnational and national governments and their announcement policies? Well, I think we think that cities are at the heart of it, in conjunction with national governments. And I think that's a really important conclusion from the research, is that perhaps 5 or so years ago, many places would be trying to do their own thing, and would be aware of regional and national policies, but fundamentally they were slightly disjointed. What we've seen evolve is much stronger processes for blending national, subnational, and city level programs. So, for example, the point about governance and creating formal structures, one of the things that allows you to do is to have a dedicated place, a dedicated forum by which a national representative can be involved in a particular city. And likewise, some national forums do have representatives from city. So we see cities at the heart of it. It's hard to generalize about cities' powers, particularly on fiscal and financial levers. But as a rule, almost every city in the world has some important lever that can lead or support mass EV adoption. So road space is pretty fundamental. Many have some degree of influence over public transport, even if it's run at a regional level. They have some degree of influence. Infrastructure rollout and the physical location of charging. Most cities have oversight of whatever planning or development or spatial policy is necessary to make it a success. So I think cities we see as at the heart of it, in conjunction with national. On Gabriel's question, Kate, do you want to pick up on Shenzhen perhaps as an example of that?
Yes, so Gabriel's question is, what has successful partnerships between cities and automakers look like? Are they simply providing input on incentives programs or providing vehicles for government fleets? And so Shenzhen is a great example of a successful partnership between city and automakers. The bus fleet in Shenzhen was rolled out with a collaboration between BYD, which is the bus automaker established in the city, and the city authority. And BYD really, they worked with the city authority to actually ensure that there was like troubleshooting of the vehicles as they were rolled out, because this was very kind of early technology in 2012, 2013 when they started to put vehicles on the road. And this actually, you know, they worked together in this, providing financial support as well. But it was a two-way process, really. Do you have anything else to add to that, Gordon?
I don't think so. The one clear conclusion was that the specific design considerations of certain sorts of vehicle can be really really contextual and really kind of related to a city's history as much as its physical layout. So if a city is used to certain sorts of vehicles or certain culture of accessing public transport, that can then influence how their citizens feel they should be able to access future transport systems such as EV buses. So the point of a close relationship with manufacturer is to understand how those types of consideration that can be politically very important in a city and might not be obvious if you are a bus manufacturer. You might go, right, well, here are my technical specifications, here are my design considerations. You might not pick up on those quite specific cultural factors that can be important in mass uptake. Okay, so that's a question from Jacopo. Could you give us more info on what cities are doing to make EVs affordable also for lower income people? Yeah, there's a couple of examples. In California, for example, the national subsidies are particularly targeted on lower income people. So there is an income criteria, and you can get a bigger subsidy if you're a lower income people. It tends to be national subsidy schemes for the purchase of the vehicle, and cities' abilities to add to those varies. But there are others who have considered or looked at adding an extra subsidy to the national scheme that is particularly targeted at lower income people. There are other tools that can be used in the spatial distribution of electric vehicles. So, for example, some places would make in contracts with charge point implementation programs, they would make particular demands that certain areas of a city that they would worry would otherwise be missed off are included. So something about the contracts with infrastructure providers, making sure that all areas of a city are included. One of the more hypothetical solutions could come from electric micromobility and the potential for mobility as a service to lead into mobility credits. So the idea that you can access a range of transport through one integrated system, and if you have that one integrated system, then you could top up certain users with more or less credits depending on income. And that's much more speculative. But the reason we included micromobility as a core chapter is because this is the new frontier of mobility, and understanding how electrification can sit alongside that new technology is really, really important.
So we have another question from Jonathan Robichard from Montreal. So any thought on the capability of on-street public charging infrastructure to substitute private charging infrastructure in high-density city core, so where private parking space is rare? So we've done a lot of, well, some of the case studies are looking at charging infrastructure in particular, and especially in, there's a whole chapter about private car ownership, and that looks at several instances of charging infrastructure development. We found that it varies across different cities, and there's been different approaches by different cities. So, for example, the Netherlands is a great example of a very expansive electric vehicle charging network, with lots of public charging infrastructure available. And whereas in a lot of the Norwegian cities, you can see there's a lot more private charging spaces available. So there's obviously challenges in city cores with the high density of houses. Depending on the city, there's often not charging space. There's not private car parking spaces, so driveways or garages for people to park and charge. Having charging hubs, for example, in Dundee, there's charging hubs available with rapid chargers, really gives people the opportunity to charge up in less than an hour if they don't have those facilities to have private charging infrastructure. Do you have anything else to add to that, Gordon?
Just to say, I think one of the emerging markets in charging is charge points that reflect a city's built environment. So charge points built into lampposts that are designed in whatever type of lamppost is there. Another example in Dundee, charge points have just gone in that go into the ground. So I think the charging manufacturing scene has moved from just speed and reliability and functionality through to design and being able to integrate into a city centre for exactly that. And a question from Andrea: has the development of EV use in cities to be considered in an integrated approach with the electrical power production? Short answer, yes. And in the maturity model, there's a specific line on energy systems and a range of ways in which that can be the case. And in the case studies, there are examples of cities where they haven't just gone, right, let's do electrification, but they've thought in the round about electrification alongside renewables, so the entire system is lower emissions. So, for example, Izmir and its electrification program for its buses built a solar roof on its bus depot. So the entire systems are seen around. I think that's probably one difference again between an early and a mature system. It's really straightforward to do something that's just EV, but a mature city sees it in the round with electrical power production too. Great. Okay, well, I think we're just before 3, so I think we'll wrap off there. I think that all that remains to say is once more thank you to the project partners at the EVI and the HEV TCP. Thank you to those of you that asked questions, and I hope we answered your questions. Thank you everyone for your time and for listening to us. And I would encourage you to go and have a look at the full report, and look forward to seeing future EV innovations from across the world in future projects. So we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much.